they have been, Job and his three friends have been going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on why Job is going through what he's going through. And they've all been talking about how they have wisdom and they are speaking the wisdom of God. And the 28th chapter basically comes in and says, if you want to find wisdom, it has to start with God. It can't start anywhere else. The fear of the Lord is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. And so
You don't know who, you still don't.
well, it's obviously the person who wrote the book,
Okay.
but who that person is, we don't know. But it doesn't, because if you'll look, chapter 27 says, and Job continued his discourse, and then it ends at the end of chapter 27, and there's no indicator in chapter 28 as to Job continuing to speak. Then you go over to chapter 29, and it says Job continued his discourse.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there is this 28th chapter that is inserted to kind of bring clarity out of all of the insanity that's been going on. And the back and forth accusations that Job makes against God and that Job's friends make against Job. And what chapter 28 tries to clarify and bring into focus is the fact that if you're looking for wisdom, wisdom has to begin at one place. And that is, we have to surrender ourselves to who God is. God is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And when we begin there, then we can begin to find our way through the confusing things that go on in life. But tonight we're going to focus on the words of Elihu. Basically in chapter 32, what Elihu does is kind of goes on and on and on to say, I listen to all you old guys talk because I'm a younger guy and I didn't want to intrude on the wisdom of years. But he said, I've sat here and listened to you guys and you haven't said anything. You haven't said anything at all. And he said, specifically to Job's three friends, he said, you guys sat here and let Job impugn the character of God, and you weren't able to get him to quiet him. You weren't able to show him. I mean, how ridiculous is it for these guys to not be able to defend the character of God? And so Elihu begins to speak, and essentially that whole 32nd chapter is just him saying, I've listened, and now it's my turn to speak. So you guys sit down and you guys listen to me. With all due respect, you older gentlemen, sit down and listen to what I have to say. And so he launches into chapter 33, and he directs his comments directly to Job. He goes right after Job and begins this discussion by challenging Job on the basis of what Job has said. And he specifically addresses the accusations that Job has made against God, that God has somehow failed morally because Job is being unfairly judged. Look at the opening verses here of Job 33, starting at verse 1. But now, Job, listen to my words. Pay attention to everything I say. I am about to open my mouth. My words are on the tip of my tongue. My words come from an upright heart. My lips sincerely speak what I know. The Spirit of God has made me. The breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me then if you can. Stand up and argue your case before me. Drop down to verse 8. It says, you have said in my hearing, I heard the very words. I am pure. I have done no wrong. I am clean and free from sin. Yet God has found fault with me, and he considers me his enemy. What happens as Elihu begins to speak is he begins to answer this question that we've been dealing with all along, and that's, why does God allow bad things or destructive things to happen to people who would appear to be good people? People who, as we look at their lives, they're righteous and godly people. Why does God allow that to happen? Or in a larger sense, why does a holy, righteous, just God allow evil to exist in the world? Why does he allow that to happen? And what Job has said, now stop and think about this with me for a second. Job says, I'm a good guy. I haven't done anything wrong. God is wrong for finding fault with me. What do you think about that?
Scary.
Well, not only is it scary, how do we understand God? When we talk about God, what is our mental picture of who he is? Is it possible for him to be flawed?
No.
Not at all.
Nothing.
He's almighty.
Not at all. Is he the epitome of justice?
Yes.
He's the epitome of righteousness, is he not?
Yes.
I mean, everything that we know about perfection, holiness, righteousness, justice, equitability, all of those things, God is all of that.
Yes.
And it all flows out of his being. He is the one who has established the universe with that kind of understanding. Okay? The moral, it is said that our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong, is part of the thumbprint of God on humanity. It is part of how we are created in the image of God. That we have a sense of, for instance, the weak should never be taken advantage of by the strong. Okay? Adults should never pick on children. The disadvantaged should be aided in some kind of way. You don't see, you see it in certain times and places, but there is kind of this universal sense of, if someone's poor, or we even say it in this way, don't kick a person while they're down. Okay? There is a sense of how we should treat one another. Okay? So does it make sense for Job to say, I haven't done anything wrong? And then how does he say it here? You, God, yet God, I haven't done anything wrong, yet God has found fault with me. Doesn't make sense, does it? Okay? And so Elihu begins to call Job into account for some of the things that he has said. And Elihu even points it out in verse 8. He said, you have said this in my hearing. He said, I'm not taking this from what someone else said. Job, I've heard you say these very words. Okay? Elihu goes on, he says, Job, you are not right in this, because God is far, look at what he says, God is far beyond any mortal. Verse 12, he says, but I tell you, in this you are not right, for God is greater than any mortal. What Elihu is saying here is it possible, is it even remotely possible that a mortal human being would be so good as to be able to accuse God of having failed morally in dealing with that person? No. That person does not exist. And Elihu begins to take Job on that account. Look at verse 13. Why do you complain to him that he responds to no one's words? For God does speak, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds. And Elihu goes on to talk about some of the ways that God speaks. Would you just kind of scan down through verses 14 through 28 and look at some of the ways that Elihu says that God speaks to people? Because hasn't it been Job's accusation of God that, God, I'm complaining to you, I'm talking to you, I'm calling out to you, but you won't answer me. You will not answer me. Okay? So what are some of the ways that Elihu points out that God speaks? Yeah, on a bed of pain. Yeah. And so Elihu is pointing out the variety of ways that God speaks. So what is Elihu telling Job in this about Job's complaint?
That God maybe has tried to speak, but you're not listening.
Okay? And that it's not that God is silent.
That's right.
God is not silent. God is, and matter of fact, I love the little phrase he uses here up around verse 14. He says, for God does speak, now one way, now another. What does that mean? Now one way, now another.
Different ways.
A variety of ways. God is speaking to us in a variety of ways. And then he goes on and he points out how God does that. And look at verse 29. God does all these things to a person twice, even 3 times, to turn them back from the pit, that the light of life may shine on them. Pay attention, Job, and listen to me. Be silent, and I will speak. And Elihu begins to address, and who of us haven't had God speak to us in a variety of ways? Probably all of us can identify at some time in our lives where God has spoken to us. Okay, maybe not in an audible kind of way, but we feel like God has communicated verbally to us. Okay, and so Elihu begins to challenge Job's assertion that God isn't paying attention to him. Now, based on what we know about God, don't we have, would it be an unfair thing to say that God doesn't pay attention to us? How about the person who is on a bed of pain?
It's hard to hear when your pain is screaming so
Okay.
loud.
The very well-known quote by C.S. Lewis that says, God speaks to us in our struggles. He shouts at us in our pain. Okay? Think about it even in terms of just our own physical bodies. You're working out in the yard, you pick up something that's a little heavier than what you really are capable of picking up or is wise to pick up. And all of a sudden, well, matter of fact, I was picking up some leaves and using a big scoop shovel to pick up the leaves. I was running the broom with this hand and using this arm to pick up the scoop shovel, just one-arming it. And I did that one time too many, and I felt a pain shoot up into my elbow. Okay, and had to buy one of those little bands that you know, for tennis elbow, that kind of thing. Is it not, are we not being spoken to? Was I not being spoken to at that point? Maybe not by God, but pain certainly was speaking to me, wasn't it? Put the shovel down, dude. Use 2 hands.
Yeah.
And God does the same thing to us. There are things that are painful to us in our lives. And are we listening? And that's really what Elihu is trying to help Job see. Job, the pain you're going through, God is speaking to you. Now, is he condemning you for being an evil man or a wicked man? Not necessarily. But he is speaking. He is speaking. And so as we're looking at this thing of judging God and being critical of God, number one, we know that God is not going to be immoral or unjust. He is not going to do that. Okay? Number two, do we think that God is going to let us go on day upon day upon day without helping us understand what's going on in our lives? Of course he will. Of course he will. So Elihu begins to deal with that. Chapter 34. Let's move over to Job chapter 34. And he opens the chapter by saying, "Hear my words, you wise men. Listen to me, you men of learning. For the ear tests words as the tongue tastes food." What's he saying? That's a good comparison, isn't it? The ear tastes or tests words as the tongue tastes food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, something you may or may, but your taste buds make that distinction for you.
Mm-hmm.
So what comparison is he making to our ears and their ability to test word? And so what then is he saying to the guys who are listening to him, to Job speak? The tongue tastes whether or not food is good. The ear tests. It's hard to keep those words straight. The ear tests whether or not words are good. So that's what Elihu is asking them to do. Use your ears. Listen, is Job saying good stuff? Is Job speaking the truth? Is Job speaking accurately about God? Okay? Matter of fact, I love the way the Message says this. It says, "Can you believe this guy? Can you believe what this guy is saying?" You know, it's really cute and captures the essence of it. He accuses God of injustice. Have you ever had someone accuse another person of something, and just on its face, it's so ridiculous that you don't even consider whether or not you're going to believe it, because it's so ridiculous. Okay? Courtney used to sleepwalk. And it was always so funny, because when she would come into the room where we were, even when she was junior high school, early high school age, she would come in the room and she would always have an expression, something like this on her face.
Yeah.
Because she was asleep. And she'd have this puzzled, kind of a squinty, trying to make sense out of what all is going on around her, you know. And it was so hilarious, because she would come in the room, both of us would know instantaneously, she's not awake.
Yeah.
Just tell her to go on back to bed. And she would stand there and argue with us. "I am not asleep. I am not asleep." And we're sitting there and we're going, "Sweetie, just go to bed. Just go on to bed." Can you imagine somebody standing up and saying, "I am a righteous God, and God is treating me unjustly"? It's ridiculous on its face. And Elihu takes basically chapter 34 to point that out, that it is a ridiculous it's a ridiculous thing. I've been having trouble with my voice all day long. And this whole thing really brings us to the question of why do the righteous suffer? Okay? Because the accusation that's made against God is made by people who don't have any understanding of God's ways. Okay? They accuse God, and even, Job does it, perhaps even we do it from time to time, and entertain for a moment that somehow, God's not being fair to us. I mean, isn't that the fundamental question that got Adam and Eve started on the wrong path?
Mm-hmm.
That somehow God wasn't doing the right thing for them. God was holding out on them. Okay? And there is this open door then to accusation against God, and we really don't understand His ways. How well do you think we as Christians understand God's ways? Most of us here have been parents. When our children don't understand what we want them to do, it's often then that they will accuse us of being mean parents, or of being unfair to them, or treating them with less than respect. And I think there's a real lesson there for us to learn in terms of God's dealings with us. Why is it that our kids often do not understand what we are trying to teach them as parents? Can I tell a story on myself? When I was about, must have been 9 or 10, maybe a little bit older than that, we had gone back to Indiana to visit our family. I have a cousin that's a couple of years younger than I am. And he and I were having a disagreement one day. And it occurred to me that because I'm a couple of years older than him, I was his elder. So I went to my mom and my grandmother, and I appealed to them to make my cousin do what I wanted him to do, because he needs to respect his elders. Now, is that ridiculous, or is that... But I'm telling you, I was as dead serious about that as I could be. Do you see any of Job in that?
Yeah.
Any of Job's misunderstanding of how things work? Misunderstanding of God's ways, and responding to God out of his immaturity and his lack of understanding. And when we stand back and, if you will, judge God because he doesn't do things in a way that we would agree with or prefer or even think is right. For instance, the parable that Jesus taught about the workers who were out working in the field, and they worked all day long, and they had an agreed upon wage, and it came to the end of the day, and they came to get their pay, and they didn't realize that Jesus had hired other workers. Some came at the middle of the day, some came just before the day was over, and they all got the same pay. And the early workers got all upset, and they said, "Whoa, you're not treating us fairly." And the master said, "You know what? This is my wage to do with as I wish. I'm paying you what you agreed to work for. Why is it even a concern for you? They didn't understand what the master was trying to do. And often, we're in the same boat when it comes to our understanding of what it is that God is trying to accomplish. Job certainly was in that place, because God had done everything but make an accusation about Job's integrity, about his upright life. He had done quite the opposite. And yet Job, because he couldn't see what God was doing, Job began to question God. And Job began to impugn God's integrity and God's character. And it's as ridiculous for Job to do that as it was for me to expect my cousin 2 years older than me to respect me like he would a grandparent. Okay? Now, don't you guys think I'm an awful guy because of that? Look at verses 10 and 15, 10 through 15
Of 33.
of 34. So listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong. He repays everyone what they've done for what they've done. He brings on them what their conduct deserves. It is unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. It's unthinkable. Okay? It's unthinkable. Verses 16 through 30. He talks about, can a person who hates justice really rule? If God were unfaithful to being just, would he really be able to function as God in the universe? What do we expect from leaders of any kind? What do we expect from them as they exercise the authority that they've been given?
Direction.
Pardon?
Direction.
We expect direction, okay?
And perfection.
And perfection, okay? Which we know no one can give. What else?
Consistency.
Consistency. Absolutely. Anything else?
Fairness.
Fairness. We expect, why was there such a big furor in San Francisco 3 weeks ago when the state senator was arrested? Because he, according to the accusations, they've not been proven yet, so at this point they're only charges against him. But he was misusing his authority to get legislation passed through our Senate here in the state of California, legislation that would be preferential to one group over another. Well, we will not allow that to happen. At least that's the general mindset. I know there are some who would think that all government is corrupt to some degree, and perhaps there's some merit to that. But we expect those that rule over us to be consistent. We expect them to be fair, and we expect them to be upright and not preferring one over the other. Okay? Well, if we expect it of that group, certainly we would expect it of God, right? And that's what Elihu asks. He says, if somebody's going to pervert justice, how can he govern? How can he lead? Are you saying that the God that you serve is a God that perverts justice? Doesn't make sense.